Welcome. All right, thanks everybody for coming out on this cold February evening to AngularTO. This is our first meetup of 2019. We're here at Rangle.io. We're a digital transformations company. And we've got a couple wonderful speakers for you lined up tonight. So our first speaker of the night is Mr. Ehsan Motamedi. And he's going to be talking to you about Augury. And without further ado, Ehsan.
Hello. Hi, everyone. How are you guys? Good. Okay. So thank you guys for coming out. I'm Ehsan Motamedi. I'm a director of architecture and innovation here at Rangle. I help companies with their digital transformations, including with front-end technologies, DevOps, cloud ops, analytics, machine learning, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Please tweet at me. I'm trying to use Twitter more in 2019. So yeah, Ehsan Motamedi. Today I'm going to be talking about Augury Labs. But before I do, I need to give a huge shout out to Andrew, Steven, and Fabio. I believe Fabio's in the crowd here. So these guys really helped out with this presentation. And all four of them, including Santiago, actually are the contributors for Augury Labs. So this wouldn't have been possible without them. So thank you guys, really appreciate it. So I'm gonna talk about how we got to Augury Labs, how to install it really quickly, and I'll show you guys a little demo, a live demo with network calls, so nothing will go wrong, I'm sure. And then I'm gonna talk about the future of Augury Labs and where it's going. So first, how did we get here? So it all started with Augury. How many of you guys heard of Augury? Awesome. How many have used Augury at some point in your lives? Okay, fewer people. How many of you continue to use Augury today? Okay, fewer people. So I'm going to address that. That's kind of what we expected. So Augury is one of the most used tools for debugging, profiling, and inspecting Angular applications. It's endorsed by the Angular core team as the official Angular developer tool. And it's a DevTool extension. So there's a components tree where you can look at all the components and also look at the state managements, all the states. So for example, we have a MSG field here that this person's going to change, and it's going to reflect in the app. So it really allows you to inspect the state, or inspect the components. It also has a router tree, which is really useful, and an ng modules tab as well, which isn't shown here. And so we discovered that a lot of users are using it, but as developers become more experienced with Angular, they're using it less and less. But it does have a lot of users still. There are over 200,000 Chrome users, over 2,500 Firefox users. It's been going on since, it's been live since May 2016. So we asked ourselves, how can we do better? How can we provide more value to developers? And we really took a look at Augury and realized not only, developers are starting to use it less and less, but there are a bunch of issues because it uses multiple execution contexts. And also, some companies don't allow this DevTool extension because of security reasons. So we came up with Augury Labs. So Augury Labs is an experimental instrumentation framework used to profile, inspect, and troubleshoot Angular web applications. It's different from Augury because instead of it being a DevTools extension, it's actually 2 NPM packages that you install inside your application. So it gets rid of the whole multiple execution context issue. It allows you to do a lot more cool things. And the performance profiler is something that we feel like developers will continue to use as you get more experience with Angular. So this should be very useful. So I'm going to show you guys how to install it really quickly. I'm going to skip a lot of details. I only have 15 minutes, unfortunately. So there are 5 easy steps. Now, I know that sounds like too much, We are going to create a ng-add schematic to make this much easier, but I encourage you to use it now and try to install it and play around with it. So don't be intimidated. Every step is very, very easy. So the first step, as you would expect, is to install the NPM packages. You know, straightforward enough. You guys still with me? Make sense? Cool. And then all you have to do is create a new bootstrap file, main Augury, and you copy and paste this text in there. It's very straightforward. I don't have time to go in through any of these, but feel free to approach me after if you have any questions about this. And then we're actually going to use the bootstrap file that we created. So we have to create a new project configuration, a build and serve within your Angular JSON. So here you see we're actually replacing the main bootstrap file with the main Augury. And we're also creating a serve that targets the build that we just created. And make sure you put in your project name in here. There's a little manual edit in there as well. So pretty straightforward. This is pretty common. And then these next two steps are optional. So you can create a new NPM script in your package.json to make it a little bit easier. And then you actually run that with npm run start Augury. Okay? So 5 easy steps. Like I mentioned, we're going to do an ng-add soon. But please try it out before then. It's not intimidating, I swear. It'll be very easy. Cool. So now I'm going to show you guys how to use it. So this is a live demo with network calls. So hopefully nothing goes wrong. So this is Augury Labs. It's a little pop-up, okay? And on the right-hand side, there's a control panel. You can pause and record. You can clear. And as you interact with the application, this is just a sample application, you'll see it'll record the different events in this timeline overview, and you can actually zoom in by selecting an area, and that shows up in the timeline details view. And there are a bunch of rows in this timeline details view. The first row is the different tasks. So this one is a anchor element. This was the click that you saw earlier. And each of these zone tasks can usually produce an instability period. This is when Angular is trying to figure out what you did and what it needs to do in reaction to your action. So as you can see here, it removed all of these components. There's a little component tree, and the ones in red are the ones that are removed. I believe later on, you'll see them being re-added here, right? And then finally, this last row here has change detection, which I'm going to show you in a little bit more detail. It shows you the instance check counts for each of the components, which is pretty useful. And I'll show you right now. So in this app, there's a little favorite button here. I'm going to favorite one of these articles. And you'll see there are a bunch of clusters. In this first cluster, this again is the HTML button element. And you can see each of these rows is one article preview component. Within that, there's an article meta component and a favorite button component. So it's actually iterating through each of the favorite buttons, even though we only clicked one. And that's, you know, in a bigger application with maybe 1,000 different components, this could be costly. So we're actually going to go into the preview component and see if we can prevent it from going into every single preview component. And how do we do that? Can anyone guess? With change detection, woo, on push. Cool. So this is the preview component. App is refreshed. Let's clear. Let's like another article. And we're going to go back in. And you'll see, although it did check all 10 preview components, it didn't actually go in to each of those and do a change detection on each of the button components. So we've saved this application a couple of milliseconds. So this is just a demo of how you can use it. Of course, this didn't make a big difference, but with a larger application, it will really help you decide where is that performance issue, and really try to get rid of all the non-Angular noise to determine that. Cool. So now let's talk a little bit about the future of Augury Labs. So like I mentioned, there's the Performance Profiler plugin. We're thinking of adding more plugins. There's currently some code for the unit tester plugin. It's not live yet. There's no NPM package that's published, but you can see the code in there in the source code. And so this is just a proof of concept, and it allows Augury Labs to be more of an automation testing tool or reporting tool. It publishes a Augury UT object in the Windows object, and it lets you write unit tests that monitor the change detection. So this could be very useful, for example, in your regression testing, in your automation pipeline, your CI/CD pipeline. Yeah, it's something that we're working on. We'll also be providing more documentation around this, especially documentation around how can you create your own plugins using this Augury Labs framework. And we're also thinking about things like official pre-change detection, post-change detection hooks, RxJS tools, NGRX tools, and live editing, especially when Ivy comes out. And we really want to hear from you. So please, please, please install this in your application, play around with it, submit bugs, submit feature requests. We really want to know what you guys are using this for, so we can build upon it in the direction you guys want. So here's some further resources. We'll publish this later, and that's it. Thank you, guys. Cheers.
All right, thank you, Ehsan. And now before we get to our presentation from Narwhal, we're going to do a quick 5-minute bio break. So grab some pizza, use the facilities, whatever you need, and we'll meet back here in about 5, and we'll move on to our Narwhal presentation. Thanks again, Ehsan.
Cheers.
All right, welcome back. So our next speaker is, welcome back, and our next speaker is from Narwhal. Jason Jean is going to be here to tell you about building large Angular apps successfully. And I'm going to just get out of the way and let Jason take the floor. Thanks, Jason.
Hey everyone. Okay, so I'm going to talk about NX today. Does anyone here use NX? Okay, that's not that many. It's okay. Who works on Angular apps at work? That's a lot more people. Okay. Who works on more than one Angular app? Okay. And who creates like shareable libraries that they can use in multiple apps? Okay, so that was a lot more hands than the amount of people that used NX. So I'm going to tell you why you're doing it wrong, or not as well as you should be. Yeah? Okay. So I'm from Narwhal. Narwhal is founded by Victor Slavkin and Jeff Cross. They were originally on the Angular team, and they assembled a lot of experts in the Angular field. Okay, so we're going to start with me, and then we're going to go through 3 different things that Narwhal does. As for me, I worked on Angular Universal. I worked on Angular CLI. I still do today. But the reason I'm here to talk to you is because I work on NX. For training, we go into organizations and do workshops. So the overall theme for Narwhal is that we empower your company to do things, and we don't really take on projects just to deliver it back to you. So one thing we do is workshops where we teach you how to use Angular. And then the other thing is actual consulting, where we take our team and make it part of your team so that we can help you teach your developers. You can get up to date really fast because we're all experts in Angular, and just if you have any hard problems, infrastructure, setting up your code base, we can help. But for today, we're going to talk about the tools. So the first tool is NX. NX is Angular CLI power-ups, or an extension to the Angular CLI, which allows you to do more enterprisey or just more modern ways of developing. I'll get into more later. We just launched a new website called nx.dev, so you should definitely check this out. The second tool we make is the Angular console. Anyone use Angular console here? Okay, about the same people that use NX, plus a few. Angular console is the CLI's UI. So the CLI has a bunch of commands that you can say, generate this, generate that, build this, test that. I'm kind of an expert in the CLI, but sometimes I forget all the options or I typo them. And it'd be much easier if there was a button I could press. Yeah. And we launched our VS Code plugin. So this is the Angular console living inside VS Code. You can see that you can build applications, serve applications, and down at the bottom over there, you can see everything that's running. So I have my Angular app served. I can view it in the browser. And then I also have tests running as well. And this all happens in your editor. So as a visual way to interact with your code, this is angularconsole.com, where you can go to find out more. Angular Connect is our support and empowerment platform. So this is where you can basically call us or submit a ticket to Narwhal engineers, and we'll help you fix your problems from your desk. So it's also built into Angular Console. There's a separate link for it, or a separate tab. And you can find out more if you go to connect.narwhal.io. Okay, and let's get into NX. So NX, as I said, is built on top of the Angular CLI, which means anything that you do in the CLI, you can do with NX. It's literally an Angular CLI workspace. But it allows you to do 3 things. First of which is to use modern tools. I would dive into each of these. Build full stack apps, which is really cool. And then finally, maybe most importantly, what we'll build up to it is to develop like Google, whatever that means, right? So for modern tools, we use Prettier. Prettier does code formatting so that you don't have to get comments on your PRs like this. And when someone really tells you to use spaces, you get really mad and you just say, Prettier did it, wasn't me. So what it does is that when you write ugly code like this, it makes it pretty, like this. Some people might kind of like not want to relinquish that control, but we find that the consistency that you get throughout your code base and just not having to worry about how many tabs you put, it saves a lot of time, right? Like those comments don't appear in your PRs, and you don't end up tabbing over lines all the time, and it makes it look pretty. Jest is a unit test framework by Facebook. They built it because the existing tools out there were too slow and they didn't work with their monorepo, which we'll talk about more later. But it's really delightful to use. Like Karma is kind of clunky. Your tests do run and they run in the browser. But Jest, it's fast. So it actually runs tests in parallel. You can see that there's about like 10 tests running at this point, right? So it's going to get through your tests much faster than Karma is because Karma is doing one at a time in the browser. It also throws great exceptions when your tests do fail. So here you see that a property is missing. So it's expecting object.foo.bar to be true, but you see the object is not that, right? It shows you diffs between what it expects and what it doesn't, or what it gets. So you can see how that works. It also does something called snapshot testing, where it takes a golden file of kind of what your component might render or what your API would return, and then compares it to what is actually running, and then it can spot differences, maybe bugs. Maybe not, you can commit those. And then Cypress. Cypress is the end-to-end test runner. That is kind of like the modern version of Protractor. So it's easy and reliable. It's really fun to use. It has this great interface for running your tests. And what I love about this is that it shows you the status of your tests. That's not that exciting, right? But it shows your tests next to it, right? So if you want to test that, you click here, you type this, submit the form. It actually tells you what you're testing instead of you having to go to the code and look that up. And then finally, it shows you your actual app running the tests right next to it. So you can see, hey, that's not what I expect. And this also gets recorded and gets saved as a video. And it's just an interface for running end-to-end tests, which has, I don't know, never been done before, I don't think. I used to do end-to-end tests in Selenium, which is like really code-based, and I don't know, it's just not great. And then I used to ship it to a server, wait for it to run, and I just get text errors, and I don't know what's going on. This shows it to you. It also allows you to time travel since it has all of those events. So you can actually go back to the point where it failed to see, hey, what does that screen look like? Is the button that I'm trying to click actually there? Maybe it's not. Okay. And then finally, Nest is going to transition us into the next section, but Nest is an Angular-inspired Node.js API framework. So it allows you to build APIs and backends, but it really does look like Java, but it looks better. It uses TypeScript, which is kind of where I got the inspiration from Angular, right? You see decorators, there's a controller for cats, and there's a get decorator that kind of sends this URL there. So for this particular controller, if you go to your API domain /cats, and you send a get request, it'll return the string. And everything's strongly typed here so that you know exactly what's being returned. There's also dependency injection. If you look at this, it's a module, but it's not an ng module that you're probably familiar with. So it takes inspirations from Angular, including the dependency injection, which you won't get in Express or other Node.js frameworks. So we definitely like using Nest. It's also very agnostic in what you can do with it. So whether you're using Mongo or MySQL or GraphQL, Nest is like a really thin layer on top of those where it aggregates them and creates composable providers for them. So you can use GraphQL if you like, or Mongo, or MySQL. It's agnostic. There's even more, actually. So that's going to bring us into our next section of building full stack apps. How many people work on backends? Oh, that's a good amount. How many people work on backends and front ends at the same time in one repo? Okay, so that's what NX allows you to do. This is kind of the evolution. So before I taught you all these cool tools that you can do what you're doing right now better and more productive, right? Next, we're going to show you how you can work a little bit more differently, or some people already do this, but it allows you to share code. So if you have a front end and your back end, one thing you might want to share is a type that comes back, right? Like, what is that GET request actually giving me? So we can share a lot of TypeScript code in the middle, write it once, and then have one source of truth for our data types, for our utility methods, business logic, you name it. It can all be shared in one repo. You can develop, commit, and validate holistically, like your whole application. You don't have to wonder, is it a backend failure? Is it a front-end failure? And when you commit those changes, when you develop a feature, you can commit your front end and your back end at the same time. You can validate it. You can run all the tests that are necessary. And you can see, does the whole system work? And if it doesn't, you don't commit it. And if it does, you commit it in one commit. And if you want to roll back, everything gets rolled back. You don't have to manage 2, 3 different repos for rolling back your code. And then we'll talk about how to develop like Google. So Google does use Angular, right? But they probably have a lot more apps than you work on day to day. I think the count is 140 something. It keeps growing, right? Because every new application they use internally and externally. They have a lot of other frameworks that they use as well, but a lot of them use Angular, and they have a lot of applications. But then they also want to share code between all those applications, so that's all under their umbrella as well. So the one thing that they do, as well as the companies that you saw before, is that they've adopted this approach called a monorepo approach. Monorepo is where you take all of your code, or at least all of your like related code, and you put it in one place. You don't split it just because it's a different backend application or a different front-end application, or just because it has to be shared between 2 different things. It's all in one place, right? And we'll go into why. Because GitHub has tons of repos, and they all work together, right? But let's see how it doesn't work. So if you go into a specific library, I'll call it, which is a piece of shareable code that you can use in multiple apps or other libraries, you're going to want to set up your unit testing, end-to-end testing. You want to set up your build tools. You're going to set up NPM, publish it to NPM, run your CI, make a GitHub repo. You have to do a lot of stuff for one repo, right? And then you have a lot of repos. So you have to copy that over and over again. And yeah, you might be able to just like create a seed repo and copy and paste that multiple times, but you still have a lot to manage. Every time TypeScript updates, you have to update it in every single repo. Okay, let's look at another reason. Dependencies. You have a lot of repos, but they're not as independent as you think. If they were all independent, then you would have 5 companies instead of 1. But they're all related. You know, you can see that the bottom library is probably something very core, maybe something like telemetry or ads, and something that like every app needs. And then you might have a library that only depends, or like you might have a library only depended on by one app. So that's a little bit of complexity that it's really hard to manage. If you have multiple repos, you have to publish it to some registry, and then the other repos have to get it from that registry. So then we get into version mismatch, right? So bottom library is really happy. They just released 2.0. And the other library over there was really happy as well because they got all the changes. But then the library over there on the far left, they're still on 1.1, right? They didn't get those changes, and that's okay. Like, it works for them, but sooner or later they should update to version 2, and you can see like all of the latency and propagating all those changes. And if it's a really important change, like, you know, ads are broken and you have to fix a bug, you don't want to fix it in the library and then like make sure everybody else gets their changes. You get yelled at because you broke their app. They don't even work on ads, and it just takes much longer than you'll see later. So those are 3 reasons I'm going to tell you about, like, how does a monorepo help that? Spoiler. So one set of tools for your whole repo, right? Like one repo, one set of tools, a lot of code. So you'll have one version of Karma, one version of Angular, one version of like one Jenkins pipeline. You just have to manage it once for your whole organization, or at least what's relevant to you. And this is something called the one version policy that Google calls it. But basically, there's only one version of that library down there, right? It's a current version. It's whatever's the latest. You know, it has all the commits. This is what Google does with Angular. Angular is just one of their shareable libraries. And once you change that, everything's at the current version, right? It's all in one repo. You can manage all the changes in there. There's no need for versioning at all, which is kind of contradictory to the name, but everything just works together. And there's only the current state. If the current state is broken, the current state's broken. You have to fix the state. And you don't have to worry about where is the break. So that also means one upgrade. When Angular 8 comes out in probably 2 months, you upgrade it to V8, maybe some breaking changes, but you do it once for your whole organization, everything's V8. How many of you go app to app to app to app and say, it's time to get version 8? That's probably going to take you a lot longer than if you had it in one repo. So that's a couple reasons why you would use a monorepo. The first thing people ask us is, but I don't want to deploy everything at once. If everything's in one repo, I have to deploy the whole repo, right? So those apps at the top are actually isolated. So if we dive in and we're working on this app, we're just, changing the way our articles show up or something like that that's only relevant for this app, we just ship that app, right? Like the other apps over there on the left or the right, they didn't change. You didn't make any changes to them. You don't touch them. They don't get deployed, right? So I'll give you another example. If you're working on this library over there, which of the 3 apps do you have to deploy? Do you have to deploy A? Show of hands? Yeah, because A uses that library, right? If you change that library, A probably changes if it's actually using a library, right? What about B? Okay. Also, yes, because it also uses that library. I don't know if people are not raising their hands because they're confused, but the thing is that if an app uses the library that you're working on, you have to deploy it when you change it. You kind of want to because you want those changes that a developer worked hard on. Does C need to be deployed? Cool. No hands. I think we're getting it. All right. So next one, I have a notebook. It's a Moleskine notebook. Has an Narwhal logo. Really good notebook. Raise your hand. I'll call on somebody, whoever I see first. Oh, yeah. There's the answer. I wasn't lying. All right. So what gets tested here? Okay, why? Yeah, so the answer that he gave was C and E. He said E gets tested because the library actually got worked on, and then C depends on that library, so it gets deployed, or it gets tested, right? So those unit tests get run, and I mean, you're kind of thinking to yourself, am I going to sit there and kind of go through all these calculations every commit? I don't want to do that. All right, so we'll talk about how Annex helps you with this, right? ngGenerate, how many people, or sorry, you get a notebook. You can come and get it after. So ngGenerate, how many people use ngGenerate? What do you generate? Components, services, yeah, good stuff. And it makes it so you don't have to write all that code. And more importantly, it makes it so that those files get generated consistently. You don't have kind of like components coming in with no HTML files or like these components use CSS instead of Sass. It's all the same and it's consistent. So NX provides you a bunch of schematics that the CLI calls it, basically things you can generate with ngGenerate. So the top 3 are app, lib, and node app. A lib or a library is a piece of shareable code. App is your regular Angular app, but because we talked about monorepos are good, you're going to want multiple apps in your repo. Node app is a backend app that uses Node. And then there's two on the sides, upgrade module. Those are for upgrade projects, so people that are still using AngularJS that want to upgrade to modern Angular, they can use those. NGRX has it all set up for you. If you've ever tried to set up NGRX, I know I've failed many, many times. It's much easier if it's just all generated for you at once. And then the last one, other notebook. Does anybody know what a workspace schematic is? In the back? Okay, we'll find out later. And then I'll ask it at the end to see who's listening. All right, so this is our repo, and we want to see what gets tested, or what gets built, what gets end-to-end tested. We're working on that library over there. You can see, as we did before, those two get tested. This is called affected in NX. You get to run NX affected test, and it'll run everything that's been affected. Whether it's everything that you have on your machine that's not committed, let's just run all the tests that we need. Remember, this is a monorepo, so like we could have literally dozens of these components. You just make some changes. Affected analyzes that through TypeScript. I'll show you later. And says those two have to be tested. Same thing for end-to-end testing, and you should use this in CI especially. So the one thing about a monorepo is that, as I talked about, there's all those tools that you should be running, and the easiest way to know that you've run everything that you need to run is run everything. But if you just kind of think about it like we were doing earlier, or if you have a tool that intelligently decides, hey, you did these changes, that means these things have to be run, it's a lot better to just run those and not run everything. So that's what affected is, and it does even more than this. You can pass in any target that you want. It can generate INTN for you, et cetera, et cetera. It also just limits what you have to worry about when you're making a change. You don't have to worry that like if you're making a change to the library on the right like we are, if someone says app A broke, or like the app on the right broke, I guess it's your left, right? The app on the left broke, you can say it's not you, right? Like that wasn't your fault. You don't have to worry about it. So we take that information and we show it to you. This is something called a dependency graph, or a dep graph for short. You can see on the bottom, the round things are libraries. These are things that can be shared across multiple apps. The boxes are apps, and if it ends with end-to-end, it's an end-to-end test. So the idea is that an end-to-end test can test multiple apps. So it's actually another project. Anyways, we show you this. It's generated from your source code. And so this is like a basic example, but how many of you have a diagram of your architecture and say like, microservice here, microservice there, and like they work together? Because I worked there for 12 years and one broke and I knew it because this one was the reason and stuff like that. It just gets out of date if you generate it with your code. You generate it every time. You put in your pull request to see like what you're adding or what you're changing. It's really, really useful for large organizations to be able to show how their code and how their projects work together, right? And one of the things is those projects have people behind them, and people are kind of inconsistent. I'm not gonna like tell you to kill all people, but like it's much better if a computer can do more things for you, right? And that's one thing we saw earlier with Prettier is you can format your code consistently, right? Like you give your computer the code, it says, this would be a nice way to show it. And you just say, yeah, I'll go and commit that. It's just consistent. It allows you to have less people kind of like having opinions and more. So workspace schematics, this is what I was talking about earlier. Schematics are what Angular CLI uses to generate code. So if like components are a schematic, ng new is a schematic, ngg service is a schematic, ng add is actually a schematic. And so we allow you to build your own. We make it really easy for you. You do ngg workspace schematic, and you can write your own. You can either modify what gets generated. If you really don't like how we set up NGRX, you can go in there and modify it so that anyone that wants to generate NGRX in your organization can do it the way that your organization does it. Because it's really hard to make a generic solution that works for everyone. Everything has trade-offs. So we allow you to create your own patterns. You might want a certain way of doing authentication, certain way of doing ads. You can generate all of that. Enforce your own standards. Once again, if the code is generated this way, no one's going to go through the hassle of changing it. So you say how your organization should do it, and you can enforce those standards by generating it that way out of the box. You can programmatically refactor your code, which, like right now, we just generate new code. But one thing you can do is you can actually go through all the existing source files and say, like, hey, I don't want that function anymore. Let's take it out and hopefully replace it with something else, unless you're magical. So another thing we can do is, because you have all these projects, it's hard to like just remember what all those projects are. One thing we allow you to do is to tag your projects. This is just like an arbitrary string that you can pass in. So you can put your own standards in here. Here we see there's like a light blue tag for kind of what type the library is, and then also a green tag for like what it might be used for. You can see the one at the bottom is shared, and the one at the left is just for home. So then you can say when dependencies come in that shouldn't come in, you can say that like state should probably not depend on UI, and libraries should not depend upwards to the application. You can come up with your own constraints that you put on the project. Maybe like ads can't depend on anything else and stuff like that. It's really up to you. There's a couple of, I think this is a really good methodology to look at your libraries in 2 dimensions. What kind of library it is and what should it be used for. And you can create these restraints that say, like, the home page should only rely on home libraries and stuff. Like UI should not depend, or like UI should depend on other UI, but state should not depend on UI. I hope you kind of get it. Okay, and with that, we'll show you a live demo of that all coming together. Any questions before I go on? Okay, cool. So let's see, we'll skip out of this. We'll go over to VS Code. Okay, so I've set up a project. If I go and minimize everything, it looks like an Angular CLI project, right? Because it is a CLI project. You have your angular.json that you're familiar with. There might be a little bit more in here than you're familiar with, but you can see, you know, these are the schematics you might want to run. These are your projects. This is your root. It's an Angular CLI repo. And then we also have this nx.json, which gives you more information about your project. This is how we're going to go through it. I'm not going to go through every file in here. We have a jest config, showing you that we use jest. And then we have a bunch of apps. So this is an Angular Toronto app, maybe that the organizers might design or something like that. NGTO is kind of maybe the front-facing app, maybe a home page for the meetup. And then the organizers app is just for organizers. Maybe they decide who's getting pizza that night, or maybe where is it going to be. And that's stuff that general attendees don't need to know. So let's put it behind another app and develop it separately. But we probably want to share code. Oh, sorry, the last app, the first app, is an API. So this is the API behind the scenes. There's a bunch of libraries that I've created. So one of them is a user library, whether they're an organizer or they're an attendee. Maybe you want to have an object that represents them, or some UI that can go in here. You have some shared components, right? And if I just show you this, you don't know what's going on in this project, right? You just know that there's a lot of code. I just told you what's going on, but if it's your first day at the company, you don't know what's going on, right? So let's go ahead and run your RN depth graph. You can see I've already done that above because I was testing this. So this is what shows up. It doesn't look the nicest. Let me zoom in like 7 times. So these are the projects I just talked about. You can see that the The organization's end-to-end tests run on the organizers app, which depends on shared components and the API. And same with the Angular Toronto, depends on the API as well. You can see that the API depends on the user, and the organizers depend on the same user. Angular Toronto depends on the same user, right? So like, I didn't draw this. It probably would come out much worse if I drew this. This was generated from the code base, and as I make changes to the code base, as I add more apps, as I add, maybe split out my libraries into more granular dependencies, it generates all of this. And one thing you can do is you can, I'll try to show it here, is show what gets affected. So I can do affected, dep graph, and let's say I change the following files. What's a good file to change? Let's change our shared components. So I have an index.ts here. Let's just copy the path, and we'll go and paste that in. So I'm just kind of telling it, hey, I changed this file, but there's like more high-level ways to say this. So what you'll see is that certain things have been highlighted in red. Again, it's like really small. Shared components is a thing that I actually touched, right? I made a change in shared components, but you can see that the organizers app and the Angular Toronto app, they have to be tested. They have to be end-to-end checked. They have to be deployed eventually when this commit goes live. And you see API and user over there because they don't depend on the shared components. You don't have to touch them. You don't have to worry about them. So that's what we were doing before with the exercise. So I don't have any, let's see, git status. Okay, so I have made some changes. It's gonna look probably bad if I do this, but I'll do it anyways just to show. So you can also pass in like uncommitted. So if you're working locally, you can do this one. So I had changes to the organizer app.module. So you can see that only the organizers were changed, right? And you don't have to test everything. So it uses Git to get this information. You can also use two different Git SHAs. You can say this commit versus this commit, what changed, and things like this. So that was dep graph. Let me show you how you actually run everything. So I told you it was an extension of Angular CLI. Angular Console is the UI for the Angular CLI. So if you can use Angular Console with the Angular CLI, you can use it with the NX. So we'll go in and see our projects. This is a great way to organize or like to navigate your projects. You can say that like this is easier to say, oh look, I have an Angular Toronto app and I also have an organizers app. Let's go and start up the organizers app. So you get this nice UI, you get all of your options here, and you can say what port. This is all generated from what the Angular CLI like would use. So if I'm running it, it's going to do a build. Server started, I can see my application in the browser, wait for the build, Webpack, 92%, yay. Watching for changes, there's my app, right? And this can actually make a call to the backend. So let me show you that. If I cancel this one because it's not using the backend right now, let's go to Angular Toronto. We'll serve this one. That's going to start building. We'll go to the API, and we'll serve this one as well. Just use the default things. All right, so I have two tasks running. I'm serving the front end, serving the back end, one workspace, and then if I go into localhost, cannot get that, why not? Well, live demos don't really work out every time, but they're both serving. If I wrote my applications correctly, or I tested them before I showed you, it would work. This is one workspace where you can do everything. I only have 2 apps here and like 3 libraries, or like 3 apps, 2 libraries. But Narwhal has clients that have hundreds of these, right? Hundreds of libraries. It's all broken up, and it all works in one repo. Okay, so that's the end of the live demo here. We go back to the slides, present that. Here's where you can follow us. So Narwhal _IO. I'm Frozen Pandas, if anyone knows that name better than my name. NX has its own Twitter now, so you can follow NX. We'll post updates or like tips there. And then nx.dev, please check out our new website. It looks really, really nice. Not just because I work on NX, but because it just looks really great. GitHub, Narwhal has a GitHub, I have a GitHub, and NX has a GitHub. Come to our repo, it's all open source. If you don't like the way it works, create an issue, and we'll try to fix it or help you fix it. And yeah, that's it for today. Also, we work, I don't know where I am right now, but on the other side of Union Station. So if you're looking for a new job or you think it'd be exciting, come join us. All right, that's it. Oh, one thing. Who knows what a workspace schematic is? Right there?
So specifically, the annotations, for example, or yeah, the class name and brackets and stuff like that.
Yeah, so he said it was a plan for how to generate your components, and you can do it your way.
I also have a question.
Okay, that's fine too. You can also come get a notebook after.
Yay.
Question?
Yeah, so the question is that, so in one of the organizations I worked with, so basically what we have is, so we have kind of like a UI library, and we have a lot of teams that depend on this UI library, and each team create their own project, which is like this different sections of the website. So when the UI library upgrades its versions, so like you said, we run into a very big problem of like everything needs to be upgraded, right? But because these teams are all distributed to different people, it's kind of like, can you go through an example of how people might, like all these teams, like so say for example there's 10 or 12 teams might work together to get this upgrade done?
Okay, so I'll start with the issue and how maybe Google fixes it. So the Angular team has a lot of commits, right? It's open source, people make commits to Angular, and a lot of apps use Angular within Google. And Google actually keeps up with the latest commit on master in their monorepo. So they're distributed. They're here in Toronto, so they're also like in 10 other countries or whatever. Right. Not an actual number right now. Right. So their rule is you break it, you fix it, right? So if you're working on Angular, the Angular team actually does this. They don't kind of like publicly talk about it, but they port over those changes to their monorepo, and they go in and fix those apps if they need to be fixed, which it doesn't because there's no breaking changes between like within a major version, right? Another way you can go about it is if everything's distributed, you can create a branch that everyone commits to. You might make the original commits that change the library and say, hey everybody, these changes are gonna break you. Maybe like one person from each team might be able to like help out. So you can work on it that way, and like generally how you would collaborate on code. It also works in a monorepo. It's nothing new.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, question back there.
Just hold up one sec for the mic to come back there.
Have you dealt with situations where you've moved from several repos to a monorepo, like gradually? Because I don't foresee a situation where we just go to a monorepo, like right from the get-go, I guess.
Yeah, so you probably already have multiple repos and you want to move them all to one place. And how, like, what's a good strategy for doing that? So on the surface, that's kind of easy, right? You just kind of put everything in one repo and you call it a day. But you also need to change your CI system so that it works with that, and you need to change like like maybe permissions and all of that, right? So, but all of that aside, the general rule is you just add one at a time, and maybe like every app or every repo has their own responsibility to start moving into this repo. Number one is about copying the code, but some of the issues you might come into are, you know, if you're using shared libraries, maybe it's great to combine all those libraries into one repo, and then you can publish all those libraries still to Artifactory, wherever you publish them, and you do that first, and you kind of work up. And then the apps themselves just come in when they're ready. So those are some of the strategies I've seen and like helped other people do. Yeah. If you have other strategies, like do it whatever way helps your organization. If like different teams are working on different applications, separated by teams, like each team is responsible for their own. But if you're an organization where people frequently move around, then maybe you can get it like, you can keep working on apps, but then bring them in kind of like as they're being worked on, something like that. It's up to you. Yeah. But it is being done. We help a lot of clients do it. So yeah.
In your presentation, you touched upon how the NX is supposed to help you with, like, if you change a library, you only need to deploy certain applications. Can you just explain how that works? Because I don't think you kind of mentioned that at the end of your presentation.
Okay. So if I go back to the code, I'll just show the picture. Where's the picture? It's by the code. So this one, you have to deploy all your applications, but you don't have to deploy the API. One thing that you can do is you can do, what was this test? I changed shared components, right? So instead of running your unaffected depth graph, what I can do is run, come on, get over there. So I'll run yarn affected build. I'm going to do this in parallel because it's going to take, not forever, but just forever in our senses. And what's going to happen is that you're going to see both libraries being built, and you're going to have all the dists laid out in there. I can show that as well. Apparently, I can't even build all the applications. But if I show you dist, is this big enough? Okay. So if I show dist apps, I have both my separate apps in here, the API and the organizers. For whatever reason, I forget what I built. Anyways, you have all this information. I guess like you have your own deploy process set up. There's like 10 different ways to deploy an application to the web. What we do for you is we kind of handle the build for you. If you're interested in kind of like us taking it one step further, create an issue in our repo, and we can maybe work together on a solution. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I sort of kind of understood that you're using the dependency graph to do further jobs, so I guess it's more if you're using Jenkins or something, you would script something to use that.
Right, right. Yeah, if you're using Jenkins, the other thing you can do that would make it easier, since I'm telling you to like do a bunch of stuff for like your specific, it's gonna take forever. Yarn affected apps. I'm just gonna do all, which basically means everything's been affected. It's just like the easiest flag to pass in there. So this just prints out a list of apps that you can then use in a Jenkins script to say, yeah, this is the list of apps that changed. This is a bad example because it's all apps, but yeah, this gives you the right list. So you can do your own. We also have a run commands builder. So you would do ng run your app, and then you can like set up a config in angular.json, which just runs any shell script. And it also works with affected. So if you have the same shell script, maybe called deploy, you can run that for every application, and affected would handle that for you. That one's just a little harder to set up. This gives you the information right in front of you. Cool. Other questions? Okay. Oh, back there?
I have two questions.
Okay.
So what do you use to track dependency graphs between each other, right? Do you have to manually specify which one depends on what?
Yeah, sure. It's not manual. I'll create a new dependency, I guess. Shared components doesn't depend on users right now, correct? If I go into the code and I go to shared components, this is just the index file. Don't ever, I'm just not going to do it. This is the module. If I want to depend on user, I can import user from ngto/user. I can't type. Anyways, it's not being used, but I'm doing an import in TypeScript. So when I run yarn graph, so I can show you. Boom. That dependency's been made. I'm depending it in code. So that's like the easiest way to get that dependency there. As I said, it's generated from your code. We only allow like TypeScript in the repository, so we're allowed to depend on TypeScript's modules. If you're interested in how to like expand this to other languages, then you might want to take a look at Bazel. And then you have a second question.
That was my second question.
Well, what exactly?
So are you gonna are you plan to introduce Bazel as well in the NX as well?
Yeah, so Angular CLI is hard at work at making Bazel being available through the Angular CLI and switching out the build system. NX extends the CLI. Once CLI does it, NX will have it. So coming soon, not done by me, done by the Angular CLI team, which sometimes it's me. Okay, it's confusing. It's coming. Any other questions? Okay.
All right.
Sorry.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. That was wonderful. Jason's from Narwhal, and that was NX.
Thank you, everyone.
So thanks, everybody, for coming out. Again, if you need to do a bio break, lavatories are down the hall over there to my right. There's still a little bit of pizza if you want to get to that. And don't forget to hit our sign-up booth at the front over there. I see a lot of new faces here. So thanks, everybody, for coming. It's been great.
It can drive me to your heart.